Hello Year 9, this is the first lesson of the circulatory system topic, and we're going to start by looking at double circulation. So the key questions I want us to be able to answer at the end of this lesson is what makes up the circulatory system, what is the function of the circulatory system, and how does the circulatory system work? And these are quite fundamental questions and ones that you may already have some good answers for. So let's start with the simplest question, which is what makes up the circulatory system. And it's basically the heart and the blood vessels, and we need to know about three blood vessels: the arteries, veins and capillaries. We're going to have a look at the individual parts of the system later on. So the second question I want us to be able to answer is what is the function of the circulatory system? So what is its purpose? And at this point it's really worth looking back at the other systems in the body and thinking about how they all link together, because otherwise we can come up with quite a superficial answer. So let's think back about what we already know. Well, we already know that the respiratory system, which obviously comprises of the nasal cavity going through the throat or trachea down to the lungs, the bronchi, bronchioles and alveoli, we know that the whole purpose of that system is to get oxygen into the bloodstream. Everything else, all the breathing in, the breathing out, the muscles, the ribs, everything else, it's just about getting oxygen into the bloodstream. And it does this by drawing air into the lungs, diffusing the oxygen into the bloodstream, breathing everything else out and taking any waste away. If I go over to the right hand side now and think about the digestive system, the purpose of the digestive system is to get food, and in particular really glucose, into the bloodstream. So that great big long tract through the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, the small and large intestines, all of that is just to give enough time as the food makes its way along that whole alimentary canal for the enzymes to break down the large molecules of food so they're small enough to get into the bloodstream. So the whole function of that system is to break down glucose and get it into the blood. So on the left hand side and the respiratory system, I'm getting oxygen into the blood, and on the right hand side in the digestive system I'm getting glucose into the blood. So the whole point of the circulatory system, once these things have been deposited there, is to get the glucose and the oxygen round to the cells so that respiration can take place. Now if we think about respiration and energy, then really our entire body just exists to produce enough energy in order to survive and reproduce so that our species and our genes continue into the future. Everything else is just there to make sure that that happens. So your muscles and your skeleton are to move you to somewhere to get food, so that you've got glucose which you can get into your bloodstream. Okay, you're trying to survive, so you may need to be able to run away. Your immune system might try and stop you getting ill, but everything in your body is just there to get oxygen and glucose and enough energy so that you live long enough to reproduce. And that's really all your body is there for. So when we're thinking about these systems, although we study them individually, what we should keep in our minds is what their purpose is overall. So the circulatory system is just getting that oxygen and glucose to where it's needed. So at this point it's worthwhile us recapping respiration. There's our equation there. Glucose plus oxygen gives us carbon dioxide and water, and underneath there you'll see I've put the symbol equation and balanced it. So we've got C6H12O6, which is our glucose, plus 6O2, so that's 6 oxygen molecules, making 6 carbon dioxide molecules and 6 water molecules. And this reaction is exothermic, meaning it gives out energy. So that means that the energy it's released is the energy that we use in order to live. So now we know what the circulatory system is made of and what its purpose is. How does it actually work? On a very simple level then, we know the heart pumps blood around the body and it goes through the blood vessels, and the blood fulfills a number of functions, many of which we meet in other units. But if we just focus on respiration for the moment, then it has to collect oxygen from the lungs and glucose from the small intestine. It needs to take them all over the body to wherever it's needed, wherever cells need them. And then it also needs to remove waste products. And at the moment, we're just focusing on carbon dioxide and water as the waste products of respiration. So the main thing I need you to understand about how the circulatory system works is that it's something we call a double system. And that's because the blood gets pumped through the heart twice, hence double circulatory system. And when we start looking at the heart in more detail, we'll also see that that's why there's two sides to the heart. So the first time then that the blood leaves the heart, it goes from the heart and into the lungs. Obviously there it's going to collect oxygen. We know that at the alveoli, those little air sacs, the oxygen diffuses into the bloodstream. So in the lungs we're collecting the oxygen and then the blood travels back and into the heart. Now once it gets there, we now need that to go around the rest of the body and deliver the oxygen, as well as collecting glucose and doing its all other jobs. So it's now going to get pumped out of the heart all the way around the body and then back into the heart to start the whole process again. So in effect it's going lungs, body, lungs, body, lungs, body, and so on. So it's a double system. Now the other thing that's a little bit odd about this diagram is, if you're really awake at the moment, you'll have spotted that the left and right hand side of the diagram seem to be labelled incorrectly. So on the right hand side of the diagram I've got left, and on the left hand side of the diagram I've got right. Now that's because when we draw a diagram of the heart, it's not our heart we're imagining, we are looking at somebody else's heart. So if I were a doctor and I'm looking at my patient in front of me and I held up my right hand and pointed, I would be pointing at the left hand side of their body, which means that when we draw a diagram of the heart, we're drawing the heart as it belongs to the patient. So in this case, the left hand side of the heart appears to be on our right because we are looking at somebody else. And that's the convention that we always use. So the other convention that you'll see on this diagram is that where we've got red for the blood vessels, we're representing where the blood is carrying oxygenated blood. And by oxygenated, we mean that we've added oxygen to it. So as it comes from the lungs to the heart the first time and then goes around the body, it's going to be oxygenated. On the other side of the diagram, we've drawn in blue, and that's where the vessels are coming back to the heart and the blood is now deoxygenated. It hasn't got oxygen in it, which means we're returning to the heart and lungs to collect it. Now I'm sure this is pretty obvious, but obviously you don't have one half of your body with oxygenated blood in and the other half with deoxygenated blood in. You couldn't cut yourself open and see red and blue on each side. This is just a diagram to show what's happening through the body. So using that convention from the previous slide about red and blue representing oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, then this allows us to have a look at this diagram now and understand the three types of blood vessel. So on the left hand side there, so it's the other way around to the last slide, but on the left hand side we've got arteries and they're carrying oxygenated blood to the organs of the body from the heart. On the right hand side there, the veins are carrying deoxygenated blood away from the organs of the body and to the heart, so they need to go and collect more oxygen. In the middle there we've got these tiny vessels called capillaries, and what happens is as the artery gets towards an organ, let's say it's going through the liver or it's going through a muscle, it splits into lots of tiny capillaries, and that means that that blood supply is getting all the way through that muscle or organ. So it's not part of the organ getting the blood and somehow it works for the rest. It doesn't. It goes all the way through that organ. So those capillaries are absolutely tiny. So these are the three types of blood vessel that you need to know about. So as well as knowing the three main vessels, you do need to know a little bit about their structure and what they do. So if we start with the arteries over here on the left, the first thing you'll notice is that they carry blood away from the heart. Now you don't need to worry too much about the labels on these diagrams. I've chosen them because I just think as pictures they're particularly useful. You'll see here that it says it has very thick muscular walls. That's all about the fact that the blood is coming away from the heart. Now it's got to go around the whole of the rest of the body taking oxygen with it. It's got to go up to the top of your head and down to the tips of your toes. So it's a long old way. And to get the blood that far, you need to push it with a very high pressure. And you'll see here down the bottom, I mentioned it's got very high pressure. So this artery needs to have very thick muscular walls, and those thick muscular walls will enable that high pressure to be withstood. They actually flex, they're quite elastic. And that means as the spurt of blood goes through, as the heart pumps, then they will stretch and accommodate it. which means that actually the inside means you've got quite small passageways for blood. So if you look at that little bit right in the middle here, it's a relatively small space in here. If I go over to the right hand side now and look at the veins, it's the other way round. So now you've got much thinner walls, but you have got a much larger passageway in the middle for the blood to flow. Now the veins are taking blood to the heart, so it's deoxygenated blood, they've got to go and collect oxygen. So now the blood pressure is much lower. The blood's been out to your head and your feet and it's got to get back. The blood pressure's fallen as it travels, so I don't need those very thick muscular walls anymore. The pressure's low, it hasn't got to be as elastic. I have a different problem though, and that is as the blood is trying to get back, it's going up my arms and up my legs if you like, then gravity is going to try and pull it down to your fingers and your toes, and obviously that's no good. So we have valves in the veins, and those valves only allow the blood to flow one way. So every time the heart pumps and pushes the blood around, the blood will push up through a valve, and then the valve will close, stopping it flowing back down. And those valves will allow us to pump blood down to your toes and then back up your legs, up your arms to the heart. So in the middle there I've got our capillaries. Now we've already said they're very tiny, and they are so microscopic that they are only 1 cell thick, and that's because substances have got to go in and out of those capillaries. We're trying to get oxygen to go through the wall of that capillary and into the organs, and carbon dioxide to come back. So they're very, very thin. They only have a very, very low blood pressure. They are just allowing blood to pass through and absorb what it needs to absorb and get rid of what it needs to get rid of. And this is where gas exchange takes place. That's a phrase you should have heard when looking at the respiratory system. So here oxygen goes into the cells and carbon dioxide comes out, which is the opposite to what you see in the alveoli in the lungs. I've asked the question, what looks odd here, because I want to just touch on a very, very common misconception in this topic. If I look at the diagram on the right and I follow the path of the oxygenated blood, it comes out of the lungs and into the heart, and then from the heart round the rest of the body. So there's our red oxygenated blood. Now a very common misconception is that we assume that those are all arteries because they're carrying oxygenated blood. But if we then look at what's actually up here, we've got something up here called a pulmonary vein. So it's oxygenated blood, but it's called a vein. And this is where it's important to remember that the word vein tells us the direction that the vessel is travelling in, or the blood in the vessel is travelling in, not what type of blood it is. So veins always go to the heart. So whether they're carrying oxygenated blood from the lungs or deoxygenated from the rest of the body is irrelevant. A vein always goes to the heart. So similarly, if I follow the path of the deoxygenated blood, it's coming from the organs into the heart here, and then it's going from the heart and to the lungs. And again, it's a common misconception to assume that because it's deoxygenated, this must be a vein. But again, if we look at the label up here, we've got a pulmonary artery. So arteries always come from the heart, no matter what they're carrying. There's a couple of other things in the diagram that are worth bearing in mind. The first one is this word pulmonary, which we see at the top here. So a pulmonary artery or a pulmonary vein are always about going to and from the lungs, and that's what pulmonary means. Looking down at the bottom there, we've got the aorta and the vena cava. If you're not a biologist like me, then these are the names I find most confusing because they don't seem to describe in the same way what these things do. So whereas pulmonary means lung, artery means from the heart, and vein means to the heart, I know exactly what those things do. So the vena cava and the aorta ones that you need to learn. The vena cava then is going to the heart, which means it's a vein, and the aorta is coming from the heart, which means it is an artery. That's it for this particular lesson. In the next lesson, we're going to have a look at the structures within the heart in a lot more detail, and then we'll go on and have a look at the different parts of the blood.